John Zubrzycki has now done this twice. One of the cleverest ideas I ever had was to write a book on the last Nizam of Hyderabad. And then I discovered John Zubrzycki was writing it. And then there's this extraordinary figure called Jacob, of the Jacob Diamond, who is anyone that knows their Kipling, anyone that knows their Edwardian Raj. He was a central figure who spans the world of Simla and Hyderabad. And again, this is another bright idea I had for a book. It seemed a perfect thing. And then John's got that one too. So it's only with great reluctance that I appear here on stage with him, because he's beaten me to everything I ever want to do. But he's a great, great figure, as well as having a full-time job as the comment editor on The Australian, and a full-time journalistic job. He churns out one of these extraordinary books every sort of 3-4 years that contains a huge amount of research. It's beautifully written. And I was upset to see that there wasn't more publicity for this book, because I think it's one of the most exciting narrative histories that I've seen coming out of this country for a while. And I highly recommend it to all of you. You should all go marching straight over to the bookshop after this is done. I chose it in several of the roundups as one of my books of the year. And it's certainly one of the most neglected books of the year. I think, although it's got some fantastic reviews, it hasn't got nearly as many as it should have had. And I'm very, very pleased to give John a prominent slot here to sell his wares to a much larger audience. So give us a little picture to begin with of the man we're talking about.
Okay, Alexander Jacob was, as William just has eloquently said, one of the central characters of the latter half, or the last, say, 20 years of the 19th century. I first stumbled upon him when I was writing my first book, The Last Nizam, because there's about a page and a half on Jacob, which, having written the new book, almost everything that's in that page and a half turned out to be wrong. You know, the intersection of the two stories is when Jacob tries to sell what was then called the Imperial Diamond to the 6th Nizam of Hyderabad, Mahbub Ali Khan. Now, at the time, the Imperial Diamond was 184 carats. It was the largest brilliant cut diamond in the world. The Koh-i-Noor is about 106 or 108 carats, so you can just imagine how valuable that stone was. When I was, I had to add this to the narrative for the first book, and then when I was writing those couple of pages, I thought, this is a guy who deserves further work, further research, and that's what I did. So really, armed with little more than an obituary from the Times of London, published when he died in Bombay in 1921, I set about trying to piece together this really extraordinary life. But it was, you know, of someone who was variously described at different times as Jewish, because the name Jacob suggests that he was probably Jewish, and he was a diamond merchant as well, a jeweler, an antique dealer, a diamond merchant. But then I found references to him being an Armenian, a Catholic, a Greek, a Russian, a gypsy. There was some reference somewhere to him being Polish. He was by religion Jewish, Parsi, a Muslim. He once described himself as a Buddhist. You know, so it. I mean, it was. I don't think I've come across a character, you know, who's you know, has such an array of identities and getting. And I mean, that was part of the challenge, and that was part of the joy of writing the thing, of course, was to try and find out who he exactly was.
But you never ever found an image. He remains.
Yes. No. Well, I found a sketch, but it's funny you should say that. You know, you add the last full stop to your manuscript, and it's like, you know, finishing a job. You know, you've. Or maybe even it's almost like a divorce, yes. And you think, okay, you know, that's it. But of course, with biographies, it's never the case. And since the book's come out, I've had Raja Basin, who helped me, who was a biographer of Simla, said, hey, now that the image is there, I recognize that guy. I think I've seen him in a photograph of the similar amateur dramatic society.
The Gaiety Theatre.
The Gaiety Theatre, yes. And then also someone who I met in Hyderabad researching the first book, someone who had helped to curate the fantastic displays that are in the Chal Mahalla Palace these days. She said that she thinks she has seen an image of Jacob in the collection of the Indira Gandhi National Centre for the Arts. And then, just the other day, here in Hyderabad, I met someone who...
We're in Jaipur.
We're in Jaipur, okay. My head is in Hyderabad, I'm going to Hyderabad. We're in Jaipur, who was from Hyderabad, who said they've just digitized 3,000 images from a private photographic collection, all taken around the time, or most of them taken around the time Jacob was there. So I'm heading to Hyderabad. So there may be an image.
Second edition.
Yeah, second edition, yeah.
So having painted this sketch of this guy who is famous really for two things. One for his influence on Kipling and his inspiration for the figure of Lurgan Saab in Kim. Secondly, for this extraordinary diamond scandal. Let's go back to the beginning. So where did this man come back? Which of those many nationalities?
Okay, which of those many nationalities? Well, look, there's one thing about Jacob, which was a very nice description in an article in the Occult Review of 1913, written by someone who'd spent some time with him in Bombay at that stage, and he said, look, when the real story of Jacob is written, it'll be stranger than any fiction you could possibly come up with, and that was the case. So the story of Jacob begins in Diyarbakir, which is in southeastern Turkey. It's a large city today, the de facto capital of an independent Kurdistan, if there ever was to be one. You're familiar with it. You went there, I know, for your...
It's a rough spot.
It's a rough spot, yeah. Not as rough these days. Probably rougher, actually, since I've been there because of the Syrian conflict. But he was a Syrian Catholic. His father had moved there. He had set up a soap factory in the early 1800s. Jacob's full name was often written Alexander Malcolm Jacob Sabunji, which the word sabun is the Turkish word for soap. So I managed to track him down to Diyarbakir. I couldn't find his house, but I found the school that he had gone to. And then when he was about 15 years old, he decided, for some reason, I can't, pin down exactly, but he decided he was going to leave Diyarbakir and go to travel eastwards, and eventually he landed in Bombay in about 1865.
And from there he made his way to Simla?
Yeah, Simla via, this is a young guy who's landed in Bombay. He doesn't know the language, he doesn't know anyone, and he's arrived virtually penniless. One of the stories about how he got there was on his way he was sold into slavery to a Turkish pasha, and then he, having learnt Arabic and escaped, went on a pilgrimage to Mecca. After that, ended up in Baghdad, where he was imprisoned by a beautiful woman who wanted to keep him as her slave, and had to escape through the rat-infested sewers of Baghdad. And then she got shipwrecked.
As one does.
As one does.
In these circumstances.
Yeah, when you're about 14 or 15.
And women lock you up.
And then got shipwrecked on the way to Bombay and ended up in Bombay, as I said, around about the age of 15. Yes, he became, but within 15 years, he was the most famous diamond merchant, antique dealer, magician and spy in British India.
Now that's quite a spread of careers. Diamond merchant, you'd have thought would have kept most people busy, but the other stuff too. Well,
the other stuff as well. Well, look, the magic, from as far as I can tell, yes, he certainly dabbled in magic. One of the earliest, pieces of historical record that I have is a reference to him doing conjuring tricks in Auckland House in Simla in 1876. But from what he told various people at various times and what others have gleaned from his life, he, travelled around the princely states, sometimes working in various capacities as an advisor or something like that. But he also told fortunes and
this is just to paint a picture for a second of this sort of Edwardian world interested in the occult. We've got Madame Blavatsky, we've got theosophists, we've got people doing table tapping and chasing ectoplasm across the world. Can you give a little picture of this?
Well, that's right. I mean, you had the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species, which, of course, sort of, the world, scientific rationalism would explain everything, but then there was this backlash against that as well. So you had the rise of theosophy, you had, a huge interest in the occult and Eastern religions as well. And Jacob was clever in that he knew that if he tapped into this fascination, it would get him, an entree into not only the princely courts, because they're all fascinated by this sort of stuff. If you have a Westerner performing these extraordinary magic tricks, you'd, that was a good foot in the door, but also among European society as well.
And it wasn't just being obviously a sort of party magician. He did actually move from being effectively a conjurer to someone who was claiming occult powers, which is a slightly different thing.
Yeah. I mean, I can just actually read a brief passage from the book, which does sort of encapsulate that, and also includes one of his more famous tricks. And since writing the book again, I think I've probably discovered how that trick might have actually been done. But look, I'll just read. It won't be very long, because I know that reading from books can often, be the low point of one of these things. But when Jacob was seen performing sleights of hand at Auckland House in Simla in 1876, he'd already been in India for a decade. For much of that time, he'd travelled from one princely state to another, witnessing numerous feats of magic, including the most famous of them all, the rope trick, during his stay in Hyderabad. The rope was thrown up and remained stiff, the end hidden 30 feet up, he told the American writer Mary Walter Tibbets. 2 boys went up and disappeared. Presently, their limbs were thrown down. The magician then threw the limbs on a fire, at which point a little girl, their sister, cried out, "If my brothers are burnt, I will commit sati," and rushed into the flames. All were consumed in minutes. A boy then walked in from the crowd and asked for his brother, who answered from above and slipped down the rope. Then both asked for the sister, who was found under the Nizam's chair. In 1917, Edmund Russell, who had visited Hyderabad a few years earlier, wrote of being told that Jacob was already dabbling in wizardry when he lived there in 1869. He would have been about 20. Very slight, he could slip in and out of the harems in disguise, and was begged for love potions and spells. Asked by a veiled woman to help her win back her husband's affections, he consulted his Arabic books and Kabbalistic charms, and, next day, slipped some powder and a paper on which were written some magic words. He told her to swallow the powder and stand near a pillar and wait until her husband passed. The spell having worked, she became the envy of the whole palace. Everyone down from the lowest Nalkar begins to make love philters and dreams of the magic square of agate, whose figures can be read in any direction and always give you the number you want, Russell wrote. Another report refers to Jacob being in Bareilly in 1870 to witness the resuscitation of a fakir who had been buried alive. The man was buried suspended in a deep grave by chains 3 feet from the bottom. The coffin was screwed down in the sight of many people, the local commissioner Robert Drummond recorded. Boards were placed above it 6 inches below the ground level. Earth was spread and corn was sown and sprang up and was reaped. 4 men, 2 sent by the commissioner and 2 by the Nawab, were always on guard. After 6 months, the fakir was taken and revived after being rubbed and warmed. He said he could not have been revived before 6 months expired, as he had arranged to leave his body. In 1834, the Reverend John Hobart Caunter described a variation of the same trick I'd seen in Alipurduar. Now, I'll just go back a bit because this is the beginning of the chapter, but when I was in India in not quite that old, in 1979, I was travelling through West Bengal and my train was held up by a band. It was at the time of the just the rise of the United Liberation Front of Assam. There was a lot of trouble then. So I had 24 hours to wait, so I walked outside the station and there was a juggler, surrounded by a crowd of people outside. And I watched this trick, which I thought at first was going to be, I thought he was a snake charmer because all he had on the ground was a basket covered by a cloth. But what happened next was a little boy climbed under the basket and the juggler, the magician, took this huge knife, which was about 1 meter long, and plunged it into the basket and kept plunging it so that there was no way that the boy who was in the basket could have possibly escaped being wounded. And of course, there were screams and, when he withdrew the knife, it was covered in blood and all that sort of stuff. But what happened next was really quite extraordinary. And I'm not exaggerating, and I was perfectly sober at the time.
As far as Australians...
No. This is a true story. Believe me, this is a true story. He plunged the knife in one last time and then lifted the boy out of the basket with the knife through his neck. So he actually was doing this, with suspending the boy in the air with the knife through his neck. Now, there was no brace, there was no way this could have been a trick. Somehow there was a passage through the neck that had missed all those vital organs, or maybe it was magic, I don't know. But anyway, so we'll just go back to the reading just so I can put it into context. So this is Courtner describing the similar trick in 1834. The man had seized the sword, and to my absolute consternation and horror, plunged it through the basket, withdrawing it several times, and repeated the plunge with all the blind ferocity of an excited demon until the blood ran in streams from the basket. Caunter's first impulse was to rush upon the monster and save the girl, but he was armed and I defenseless. Moments later, the basket was shown to be empty and the girl appeared nearby, absolutely sound. The great English conjurer, Charles Bertram, not only witnessed the trick numerous times when travelling through India in the first decade of the 20th century, but also claimed to have discovered its secret. The child made its escape before the sword was plunged into the basket by grasping a strap around the juggler's waist and passing between the juggler's legs, his movements being covered by the large cloth which the juggler uses for covering the basket. The performance I witnessed, however, would have startled even Bertram, who prided himself on having a logical explanation for almost everything he saw. The old man was no ordinary juggler. On that dusty December afternoon in 1979, I had witnessed what only the most renowned magicians were capable of, magicians such as Jacob, who, according to one witness, had performed a similar trick over Tiffin at his similar bungalow a century earlier. And I'll just quote this now. He dropped the point to about 2 inches below the sternum and pushed slowly but forcefully. I distinctly felt the passage of the blade, but it was entirely painless, though I experienced a curious icy feeling, as though I had drunk some very cold water. The point came out my back and penetrated into the wood panelling behind, which, if I remember right, was of cedar wood. He left none of the weapon and laughingly remarked that I looked like a butterfly pinned on a cork. Several jokes were made at my expense by the others, and after a minute or two he released me. I looked rather ruefully at the slit the blade had made in my clothes, but Jacob said, "Never mind, they'll be all right by and by." He began to show us another wonder, and I forgot all about it. But about an hour afterward, there was no trace whatsoever of damage to the clothes. Now, the man making this statement was Rosalind Donston Stevenson, or Rosalind Donston. And he is known to most people as one of the suspects in the Jack the Ripper case. Yeah. So, I found myself going on these Jack the Ripper forums, these sort of online forums where you've got to give you make up a name and you get a special password and you swap stories about who you thought Jack the Ripper was. But anyway, Donston had come to India in about 1878, which was 10 years before the Jack the Ripper murders took place. And why he was a suspect is that because he had always had a long interest in witchcraft, but he was a military surgeon, and he was also known for patronizing prostitutes, and his wife disappeared about the same time as the Jack the Ripper murders took place. So I'll just sort of read on just for a little bit longer. So 10 years earlier in 1878, 10 years before the Jack the Ripper murders, Donston had gone to India where Edward Bulwer Lytton's son, Edward Bulwer Lytton, who's famously remembered as coming up with the opening lines to the novel, "It was a dark and stormy night." He was a novelist. And he was also the father of Lord Lytton, who was the Viceroy, of course. So he went to India in 1878 and published an account of what he saw using the pseudonym Tortria Delta in A Modern Magician and Autobiography. Now, much of what he saw was pretty unremarkable. The mango trick, where a mango seed is planted in a flower pot and produces fruit, which is then distributed to bystanders before the magician makes it disappear again. But the tone of his account changes when he turns his attention to Jacob, who he describes as a native jeweller and diamond merchant of Simla, a man of immense wealth, highly educated and polished. Donston described how he called on Jacob at Belvedere, only to be told he'd be away for a few days. Undeterred, he told the bearer to leave word that he'd come hundreds of miles to see him. He also marked his visiting card with a hieroglyph in the hope that Jacob would recognize him as a fellow practitioner of the occult. The ploy worked, and 3 days later, Donston was enjoying tiffin at his bungalow with 3 other men, one of whom was a general, whose name was a household word in India, but whose real identity I've never been able to positively identify. He wrote that he was received with great impressment by Jacob, and we proceeded to join the repast. After the guests had lit up their cigars, the general asked Jacob to show them some tricks. Jacob disliked the term, but agreed to the request. He told his servant to bring in all the men's walking sticks. Selecting a thick grapevine stick with a silver band which belonged to the general, he asked for a glass of water to be placed on the table. He stood the stick on its knob in the water and held it upright for a few minutes. Then we saw scores of shoots like rootlets issuing from the knob till they filled the bowl, and held the stick upright. Jacob standing over it, muttering all the time, wrote Donston. In a few moments more, a continuous crackling sound was heard, and shoots, young twigs, began rapidly putting forth from the upper part of the stick. These grew and became covered with leaves, which flowered before their eyes. Slowly the flowers turned into small bunches of grapes, and 10 minutes later, from the start of the trick, a fine, healthy, standard vine loaded with bunches of ripe, black Hamburgs stood before us. A servant carried the vine around, and everyone helped themselves to the fruit. Jacob then covered the table with a sheet, and when he removed it, there was nothing left but the general's stick. To make sure it hadn't been a stick, Donston secretly put small bunches of grapes in his coat pocket.
Do you have any idea how that was done?
Well, it's interesting because...
Hypnosis? Or what?
Yeah, well look, there was a very similar trick which was performed by Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin, who was called, the founder of modern magic. He was a Frenchman who kicked around France in the early part of the 19th century. And he devised a trick using various mechanical. He was a clockmaker, and the story is that one day he went to get some books on making clock by mistakes. He was given books on magic, and that, the two combined to, obviously, he was able to construct these automatons, these mechanisms for making things, for these extraordinary tricks. And his most famous trick was the orange tree trick, where like the grapevine, which produces grapes, you have an orange tree which produces fruit. And that might have been the origin, and maybe Jacob, because he dealt in these sorts of things, might have picked up a a facsimile of this thing or something.
Fantastic. So alongside diamond dealing and magic, also espionage. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, okay, look, if in 19th century India, if you wanted to be a jeweler, an antique dealer, a diamond merchant, a gem trader, you really needed to know what was going on in the various princely states. So, you needed to know what the prices of turquoise in Peshawar were, what the market for rubies in Burma was, which Maharaja was on hard times and needed to offload a bunch of jewelry cheaply in order to, make ends meet or something like that. And so Jacob had a network of agents or spies in almost all the big princely courts. And
of course, in Kipling's time, in Kipling's writing, the princely states are made out to be centres of intrigue.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And see, at the time, the British intelligence network in India was pathetic. I mean, it was still called the Thuggee and Dacoitry Department, after, which had been set up in the 1830s by William Sleeman, and, but had completely missed all the signs that there was going to be a mutiny, and, and it was slowly starting to be reformed. But Jacob's network was the envy of the British, really. And so he was getting his information. It was said that, he not only traded in jewelry, but in secrets. And he used this to his advantage because, he used it to get access to the highest in the land, to the viceroys. He would pass on information which he had gathered and which he thought would be beneficial to the British in return for, getting on the right side of these people.
And so, is he working for the British as well? What's he?
Well, he did work for the British. I mean, the most famous example was, during the Second Afghan War, when the British were advancing through the Khyber Pass, and there was the fort of Ali Masjid. I mean, you must be familiar with it. You probably passed it many times. Yeah. I think for the 14,000 strong column to get past, this is a pass in the it's such a narrow defile. It's only a few meters wide. So if you don't hold Ali, if the enemy is holding Ali Masjid, you'll never get past. So he claims that he passed on, he had his spies up there, and he was able to pass on to the British the positions being of the Afghan defenders of this pass. So that was his claim to fame.
But he wasn't working in any official or even semi-official capacity?
No. Well, he also... No, not really. I mean, he did work on behalf of the British to sort of glean intelligence from... He was put on a retainer at one point by the British.
He had a retainer?
He had a retainer, yeah.
From the Dacoity department, or what?
No, from the government of India, yeah.
But let's move now on to the fictional Jacob of Kim, and you open your book with this description of the young Rudyard Kipling getting off his horse and entering Jacob's shop.
Yeah. Well, of course, Kipling first went to India. Simla in about 1883, and that was when pretty much Jacob's heyday. It was said at the time that going to Simla without seeing Jacob was like going to India without seeing the Taj Mahal. And Jacob was staying with a friend of his father's who was a manager of the Alliance Bank, and Jacob, of course, was one of his best customers. And so every day Kipling would have ridden his horse or walked up the mall to Scandal Point, which was the top of the mall, he would have passed Jacob's shop. And so it was inevitable that Kipling and Jacob would meet. And so in Kim, which is his classic novel of the Great Game, he used Jacob as a model for Lergensab, who is the healer of sick pearls and runs the school for spies.
But in the fictional one, he's very much working for the British, or even running the British operation.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, the British did suspect him of working for the Russians as well at one stage, and that was mainly to do with the Imperial Diamond deal. They thought that he was going to use the proceeds of this deal because his go-between was a Persian guy, an Armenian Jew from Persia, that he was going to use the proceeds of this deal to funnel funds to the Russians.
And just for those who don't know Kim, give a little description of Lergensab and Lergensab's operation and Kim's game and all that.
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, it's probably the most evocative passage in Kim when Mahbub Ali sends Kim. They arrive in Simla, and he says, you have to go. He sends him to Lergensab's shop, and he says, there begins the great game. This man, performs magic, but don't worry, you'll be all right. So he arrives in the shop, and he spends his first night, in this darkened shop, surrounded by devil masks and swords, and these sort of things that are making strange noises. It's this sort of cramped confines of this shop.
And Kim is terrified.
And Kim is terrified. Yeah. And sort of next morning he's just dazzled by the sight of the wealth of his antiques that he collected from all parts of Asia.
And Kim's game, talk a little of that. Lergensab makes Kim do this test.
Yeah. Well, it's called the Jewel Game, and anyone who's been a scout would probably know it as well. Where he's basically it's a memory game. He throws some jewels on a table and makes Kim memorize them. So how many turquoises, how many agates, how many emeralds, how many diamonds, or other things. And so this is to be a spy, you need to have a good memory, and this is one of the ways in which he imparts that to Kim.
So in the middle of all this diamond turns up, the big opportunity of Jacob's life.
Yeah, so the Imperial Diamond goes on display at the Paris exhibition in 1888, and creates a sensation. It's just been dug up in South Africa. It's been polished in Amsterdam, and it is the centerpiece of the international exhibition in Paris. Jacob gets wind of the fact that this diamond is on the market, and knows that it is, but of course the asking price is beyond the reach of almost anyone that is, except for the 6th Nizam of Hyderabad, who is the
richest man in the world.
And and is also a young ruler, so he's not so he's a bit reckless with his money, and he likes pieces of sparkling vanity, as the British would call them.
So how does Jacob negotiate the deal?
Well, Jacob, he implants the idea of this fabulous diamond that if the Nizam owns it, he'll be the envy of all the other princes. And the asking price is a mere 12 million rupees, which is about 50 million pounds in today's currency. But he's smart enough to ask for make the starting price very high, so that, of course, when he drops it to 500,000 rupees, the Nizam thinks he's getting an absolute bargain. So they eventually just settle on 4.6 million rupees, and he shows the Nizam a facsimile of the diamond, and the Nizam says, "Okay, I'll get it, but it has to be on an approved or not approved basis." So if you show me he convinces the Nizam to deposit half the money in the Bank of Bengal. And if he approves of the diamond, he'll pay the balance. If he says, "I don't approve of it," Jacob's stuck.
What happens? Doesn't approve of it.
Well, so if he doesn't approve of it, I mean, Jacob will be stuck with the diamond, basically.
But what happens to the money that's deposited?
Oh, well, you see, the deposit is already covers the actual price of the diamond. So Jacob is okay. I mean, he still makes some money. He won't make the huge profit that he expects to make, which will set him up for life, you know.
So tell us what happens. So the money arrives in the bank account, the diamond is delivered.
Okay. So in the meantime, of course, the British get wind of the fact that the Nizam is going to spend, 4.6 million rupees on a diamond when the state is in debt to the tune of about 10 million, and there's a famine raging, and, why does he need another diamond when he's got the biggest collection of diamonds in the world? So they try and put a stop to it. As does the Nizam's minister. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, the Nizam, when Jacobs brings him the actual diamond, says, "Napasand, I don't approve, I'm not going to buy the diamond." Now, what happens next will become the basis of a 6-week court trial in Calcutta that will make headlines around the world. Because Jacob will claim that there's a subsequent deal to buy the diamond, but at a reduced price, that the Nizam negotiates privately with him to keep the British off his back. The Nizam will later say, no, that wasn't the case. He demands his deposit back, and charges him with criminal misappropriation, and the case ends up in the Calcutta High Court.
So both men travel in person to Calcutta?
No. The Nizam won't leave Hyderabad. I mean, he is summoned to appear before the court, but he claims he can't, because in order to go to Hyderabad, he has to bring his entire harem with him, and 1,000 other sort of hangers-on, and it's far too.
Of whom there are very nice pictures hanging in Chakmahala of the harem.
Yeah, that's right. So there is a commission sent to Hyderabad to listen to the Nizam's evidence, but that evidence is ruled ineligible finally in the High Court trial, and Jacob is acquitted.
So is he ruined at this point?
Well, he pretty much is, because the publicity that this trial has generated, even though he is acquitted, has basically ruined his reputation.
What is he accused of, or what is the gossip about him there?
Well, that he's cheated the Nizam. Yeah.
The diamond isn't a fake, so what's the cheat?
Well, that he's that he's tried to rip him off, basically. Yeah. The word gets out that in fact the diamond wasn't worth nearly as much as he was asking for it, and that he lied about it, and so on. So it's a but see, there's a criminal case. He's acquitted of that, and then there's a civil case where they come to an out-of-court agreement where Jacob keeps the deposit, which in fact he's already sent back, remitted to England to the owners of the diamond, or the part that to cover the costs, and that the Nizam will pay him an additional 150,000 rupees and keep the diamond.
So what happens to the diamond? It goes back to England?
By this stage, the diamond is considered to be cursed.
Another good sort of Edwardian story.
Yeah, that's right. And the Nizam actually, when he finally gains possession of the diamond, it stays in the Bank of Bengal vault, and he tries to find a buyer for it, and no one wants to buy it. It eventually passes, of course, into the hands of the 7th Nizam, who famously uses it as a paperweight before almost losing it forever in the top of an old slipper. And I was only told the story about this the other day, actually. Somebody, again, a case of, I need to probably write a second edition of the book, that what happened was that this slipper was in a pile of clothes which were going to be burnt. And it was only...
He didn't wash his clothes, did he?
No.
He wore them once and then...
Oh, no. No, he wore the same thing over and over again. Yeah, but he liked to save money on laundry bills, so he did tend to wear the same clothes till they...
And he darned his own socks.
And smoked his guest cigarette stubs, but anyway. So it was only when a servant at the last minute, before this pile of mouldy clothes was consumed by flames, noticed that there was something hard inside this.
And it's the diamond.
Yeah, and it was a diamond.
So where is it now? Where is it?
It's sitting in the Reserve Bank of India's probably most secure vault. Yeah.
Owned by the state or owned by India?
No, it's owned by the state. Yeah.
Having done that, because there was this more recent deal, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was
between
more.
the
It's part of the Crown Jewels of Hyderabad, so it was.
Was it one of the jewels that was put on show in Delhi? In the
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I saw it. I remember that.
Yeah.
So go back to Jacob. So Jacob, having arrived penniless in India, having made this fortune, having dabbled in espionage, having played the whole game across the princely states, is now finds his reputation on the wane.
That's right. Yeah. So he basically he starts to, he's lost his best customer, who was the Nizam of Hyderabad. I mean, this diamond was not the only thing that he sold to him. He sold hundreds of thousands of rupees worth of jewels to him in the years before that. So he's lost him. The British have told the princes, don't deal with this guy. Some of them do, of course. And he gradually, eventually has to sell his business in Simla. Auctions off the contents of his famous shop. Most things go for a song, and he moves down to Bombay.
And I think you have a reading you want to do about him and his women.
Oh yes. I mean, part of the problem in researching the book was, of course, he had no descendants, and he never married. And there were rumors around that. It's funny because Kipling gives the character of Lurgan Saab this slightly homoerotic tinge, because Lurgan Saab has a young boy with scarlet lips who is always lurking in the shadows, and when
Kim is also frightened by it.
Yeah, and threatens to kill Kim. Yeah, because of he's so insanely jealous. But I mean, apart from that, I found no evidence of any of that. But I'd just like to read a passage because he did. There were rumours of affairs. One of which was with Harriet Titler, who was one of the women who, or the only woman who was
survived 1857 in Delhi.
Yeah,
and was a pioneering photographer.
Yeah, and helped Jacob. Taught Jacob painting, and then they sort of went into business together briefly in Simla. And then there was apparently another woman in Simla that he was rather infatuated about. But there's just a nice little passage which I guess sort of we don't get to hear much about Jacob because he was notoriously secretive. But it's just a nice little passage. Jacob clearly preferred French women who kept the interests of their men alive with pretty, bustling, fluttering ways. The way in which a woman from Paris modestly and gracefully lifted her dress as she crossed a muddy street had no equal in the world. The constant aim of the French woman, Jacob informed Edmund Russell, who took this all down, was to be her husband's confidant, his partner in business, his chum, and may I use the word in its best and refined sense, his mistress. A middle-class English wife, in contrast, was rather more repulsive, except on moral grounds. After producing 6 wholesome-looking children at regular intervals, she spent most of her time frittering over their nursery arrangements. As for the Viceroy's wife, Lady Curzon, Jacob concluded that she would have been much more beautiful had she been born an Oriental. Her face is spoiled by her American ambition. Very, very sort of un-PC these days, but sort of, I imagine him sort of being that sort of character.
So just conclude by briefly telling us the sort of decline and fall of Jacob at the end.
Well, the decline and fall of Jacob has him at first living in reasonably okay surroundings. You can still go to the building. It was then known as the Majestic Building. It's opposite the Prince of Wales Museum in Bombay, above Philip Antiques, if anyone knows Philip Antiques.
That's quite grand.
Yeah. But then he had to move into what was then called Watson's Annex, which is opposite the Bombay Yacht Club. And, we get accounts from him, of travellers who go to see him, because, he has this reputation for, being, a master of the occult. And, he was a colourful figure. So we get, accounts of people who visit him down the years, and each account seems to paint him as being more and more down on his luck. And then till he is being described as a dealer in old crockery, selling pieces of, selling antiques on commission for others. So he was really down in his luck, and he died in 1921, penniless, having, according to one account, dealt in something like £50 million worth of jewellery over his career. He had his estate was worth 282 rupees at the time of his death.
It's very sad trying to say the cursed diamonds did for him.
Yeah, I guess it was a curse. Yeah.
Let's open at this stage to questions from the floor. Is there any?
Hi. As you said, you have also written a book about the 18th century, and William has also written a book about the old history of India, basically focusing upon Hyderabad. So I just wanted to know that you can write a book in two ways, either just talking about the era directly, or finding out a story that is hidden from everyone, and then telling the story, telling about that era through that story. So how difficult is it to do that, and how thrilling and exciting it can be?
Yeah, well, look, if you're writing a biography or as William would know, something that's sort of like a biographical history, as the White Moguls was, you really have to immerse yourself in that period, and you might read a whole book and find one snippet of information which will go into your final work, and or you need to read widely enough about that period in order to then be able to find clues which will perhaps lead you in the direction of some vital piece of information that you need to be able to piece someone's life together. So you do. Yeah. That's it. You're imagining very much the time. The way people were thinking, what was going on at a micro level in society, at a macro level, as I've had to do in this book, because it takes in the great game at various points. It takes in the importance of the princely states, and their relationship with the British, because as I said, part of the reason why the diamond deal fell through was because the British wanted to keep the Hyderabad Nizam in subjugation, and they thought that Jacob had far too much influence over the Nizam, far too great an access to him. So they didn't like that. They didn't like this, upstart jeweler from Turkey, having better access and knowing more about what was going on in the local court than they did. So you're reading very widely, and then you come up with these snippets of information which can be quite thrilling. You sort of piece it all together, and it's tremendously satisfying.
There's the two parts really to the thing. One is the hunt when you're looking out for the manuscripts, and I think both John and I start from the position of having a story we know is going to be a good one. Whether it's a love affair in Hyderabad with White Moguls, or the First Afghan War, which is a classical chestnut. This also is something that Jacob appears in. Every book on Kipling has a bit about Jacob. Every book about the Great Game has a bit on Jacob. And you've got a story, and it is the detective work of fleshing it out, of finding that extra detail that will move this into an entire book. And then finally, there's the whole business of writing it, which is an entirely separate thing. How do you write it up? What's your audience? Who are you aiming at? And how to tell the story in the most exciting way, where to start. And these are all quite separate sort of skills and quite separate challenges that you face writing a book like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And sometimes the character is strong enough to sort of propel that along, and it comes quite easily, and other times you really got to. Yeah.
And sometimes it's a very frustrating thing when there's a story is wonderful, and you just can't find. I have so many cases like this of stories I'm longing to write, but a success of a book like this entirely depends on the quality of the documentation you dredge up, and if you can't find it, you can't write the book. Or it has to be a short article.
I'm a travel writer from Chennai, and this is not a question, but just something I'm dying to share with this whole hall. I have seen the Jacob Diamond. It's magnificent. I was tracking the story in Hyderabad, and there was an special exhibition. But the story we were told then was rather dramatic. They said the Nizam was so angry when he saw what he thought was a flawed diamond that he flung it, and it landed in a shoe and laid there for several years. And that's the story I wrote in my blog.
Yeah, that sounds like quite plausible, actually. I mean, the old Nizam did have quite a temper.
Yeah.
And
there are these amazing stories, aren't there, about the jewels of Hyderabad.
Yeah,
he had these underground silos full of trucks, full of jewels, and he always thought that if the Indians invade or if the British invade before them, that he was somehow going to. They were guarded by Bedouin guards.
Arab Bedouin guards. Yeah.
And they had tarpaulins over them, and inside the tarpaulins were trucks full of diamonds. But then they didn't bother to keep the tires pumped up.
Yeah,
so there's these sort of old trucks sitting there with these dead old sort of Arabs around the place and these sort of flat tires.
Well, I'll tell you, that's true, but you know, the sad story, which I also heard just the other day, is that we may never see the jewels of the Nizam exhibited again. And that is apparently because, I mean, the Jacob diamond was the biggest diamond in this collection, the jewels of the Nizam, which comprised something like 25,000 diamonds set into various pieces of jewelry, as well as innumerable pearls and so on. But apparently, because they keep all this in a bank vault in the Reserve Bank of India, the pearls are disintegrating. And I was talking to a curator just the other day who said that she doesn't think they're ever going to be shown again because, you know,
They're all dead.
Yeah, they're dead. So you need someone like Lurgensab who can heal a sick pearl to come on the scene.
Any more?
Kim, when Mahbub Ali sends him up from the Lower Bazaar to the Mall Road to see Dargan Sahib, there's this negotiation between the native worlds, literally rising up to the British worlds. Clearly, Jacob is a figure who sort of negotiates these two worlds very well.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about that and how he manages that so successfully?
Well, I think that was the key to his success. The key to Jacob's success was he could negotiate these two worlds. He could be equally trusted by the British as he could be by the Indians because he was Turkish. So he was sort of a man from the East, but not that Eastern to exclude one particular audience, but he was also almost, you know, because he had European manners, he spoke English quite well once he'd, you know, spent some time in India. And so he bridged these, you know, that I think was one of the keys to his success. But, you know, he also understood the ways of the Indians. He claimed once he understood the ways of the Indians better than any other, you know, man alive, and I think he did. I think that was part of his success. He did have an uncanny knack for, figuring out what people, you know, were thinking, the way that they were thinking, and you know what their desires were, what they wanted, and so on.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for John Zubrzycki.